So welcome back to another episode of the BioHub. Today, we're really excited to host Jason Lettmann, the CEO of ALX Oncology. Jason brings a wealth of experience from his roles as general partner at Lightstone Ventures and CEO of Promedior, where he led the company to a successful acquisition by Roche. With over a decade of leadership in biotech and venture capital, Jason is now steering ALX towards groundbreaking advancements in immuno-oncology. Join us as we dive into Jason's journey, the challenges and successes of ALX, and their innovative approach to cancer treatment. Welcome to the show, Jason. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Max. Really appreciate you taking some time this morning.
It's an absolute pleasure. So, Jason, just to start us off, you've been a board member of ALX for, let's say, several years before stepping into the CEO role. What excited you most about taking on the leadership position?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. So, as you mentioned, Max, I've spent the better part of 20 years of my career on the venture capital side. So was fortunate to, having been involved here since 2015, essentially dating back to ALX's roots. So myself, Corey Goodman, and John Mapons at the time, really helped launch ALX out of Stanford, and the company was based off some really groundbreaking research out of Chris Garcia's lab. That really led to an insight here in CD47 that we continue to pursue. So it's been a really fun journey, I think, as we'll talk about here today. Certainly, plenty of ups and downs, as is often the case with biotech. It's usually fairly unpredictable, which makes it fun. And that's been the case at ALX. But I think, good science here has really led the way for us and put us in a really interesting spot. And so, to your question, I think what attracted me most was the team and what, both the management team and board, who I'd gotten to know really well, was building. And I think I saw an opportunity to help. And, I think jumping in after having been on the board for almost a decade was unique in that it allowed me to know, exactly who I was going to be working with, which was super exciting, as well as, both the challenges and big opportunities that we had in front of us.
Yeah, because that's probably something you don't really think about, like as a CEO going into a company that potentially is new to you, new team, whereas in your case, it was a little bit warm, which is quite nice.
Yeah, no, it was nice. I mean, also, I think as any time you have new leadership, a bit scary. I remember my first analyst meeting, which was, I think I was on the job for 6 days. So I'm sure most of our investors and management was terrified as to what I was going to say at that point. But look, I do think it's a huge advantage to be able to know what you're getting into, and I think here it's helped me and helped the team, frankly, make a transition that's been really seamless.
Yeah, and you mentioned the ups and downs, so let's just reflect on your journey so far with ALX. Could you just share some of the most challenging moments the company's faced, and also how you've gone about navigating those?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think if you look back to 2015. In this space, in the CD47 space, there was two really divergent, I'd say, schools of thought. One is, can you drug this target the conventional way with an active FC? That was one school of thought. And the other school of thought, our school of thought, was, no, in fact, that would be very difficult. You would need a dead FC and a combination partner in order to do so. And great scientific rationale on both sides of that coin as to what was going to work. And so what's played out over the last 10 years is advancing those two concepts into the clinic. And, that is often where the rubber meets the road, particularly in randomized studies, which we've had a lot more of in this space. And I think that's what's been so defining for our company. And I think you mentioned ups and downs. And I think one of the things you see in biotech often is that a rising tide will lift all boats. And so CD47 for for many years was a very hot target. It led to a lot of money pouring in the space, and it also led to two major acquisitions, with 47 getting bought by Gilead for $5 billion, and shortly after, Pfizer buying Trillium for $2 billion. And we as a company definitely benefited from that. Just given the enthusiasm in the space, we were able to raise over $400 million. And there was a lot of interest. I think what played out is, the conventional approach, as I mentioned, ultimately didn't play out. And so when that happened, I think the tide turned a little bit, and I do think it put a very bright light on how we were different and what we could do and what we were doing that was unique. But again, I think that definitely put pressure on the company. And at the end of the day, I think, it's a good thing, right? Because it showed the differences of the two approaches and ultimately made the company much stronger. But I do think it was a challenge, of course, when there's those sorts of failures in a particular target.
Yeah, and then I always think, like, from, I suppose, almost an outsider, as an external add-on to companies like yours, like, the dynamic is just fascinating. Yes, it's about the technology and the patients, but also, you're leading a business, and you've got stock prices and all of that to worry about.
Right. Yeah, no question. And I do think that's, that can also be a challenge. I think what's really important in those times, and one of the things I saw in this team far before I joined, was just the grit and resilience and belief in the science. I think the foundation of ALX under Jaume Pons' leadership and frankly scientific brilliance is really strong. And I think having the faith and conviction in the science is easy to say, right? But it can be challenged when things play out differently in the clinic than some have thought they would. And so it requires, I think, a lot of faith and conviction and taking the long view, and ultimately taking the patient view. I think through those down periods in the space, if you will, I think we as a team and board fundamentally still believed we had a drug, and that we had a drug that was far safer for patients than the other approaches, and that we had some really, really encouraging signs of efficacy and ultimately survival, right? And I think that's what is the gas for a team in a tough time. And then, sometimes you just have to wait, right? I mean, these studies take a long time to enroll. If you look at our randomized studies, both of them took several years, and you do have to have the patience and the long view to let the cake bake, so to speak, and get to the data. And again, all these things sound like platitudes. They're easy to talk about now, but when you're somebody working at one of these companies and going in the office every day to work on these big problems, it can be challenged when you don't have as many people still believing in the concept.
Yeah, and I suppose, like, when you're looking at bringing people in, or the kind of characteristics of the startup world, do you try and point them out right at the start? You mentioned resilience, grit. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I am a big believer in grit. I think, what you often read in the headlines in biotech are the big wins and the big successes. And I think one of the things I got to know very well as a venture investor is just all the different modes of failure, so to speak, right? I mean, there's an almost infinite ways in which these little biotechs can fail. And it sounds very dark and negative, but it's really not. I think embracing that is important. I'm a big reader and believer in Marcus Aurelius and Stoic philosophy, and it's a bit of that, right? You have to embrace your own death and mortality. As dark as it sounds, it's really important in biotech because usually it's not going to work, right? And you have to have comfort with that and be able to grind and persevere when things don't go your way. So I think that is a really important trait for people who are ultimately successful with biotech. And then I think it's everything else, right? Having the curiosity and the passion, and the desire to take on huge challenges where you are likely to fail, and having a real enthusiasm for doing that, I think, is the other component. So I think when you combine those two things and then do that as part of a team, particularly a small team at a small company, I think that's when, that's where the magic happens, and it can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think that leads on really well. Like when we first spoke, we were talking about culture, how important it is to try and distill a good culture at the beginning of the company, but also how it evolves as the company grows and changes. Why do you believe it's so crucial to the company's success to nail this?
Yeah, well, I do think culture and team are, that is what often defines success. I mean, there are things that are outside of control of the team, but I do think how you respond to challenges and how you navigate, particularly in a field like oncology where standard of care is changing every few months, it's the team and the ability for the team to work together well and do that. So, I think time and time again in my venture role, betting on the team was a huge part of what we would often look for. And I think at ALX, that's what has been a real strength. If you look back to the earliest days of the company, I think the culture was really one of scrappiness, of being small, lean, making decisions quickly, moving quickly, taking risk. And I think a lot of those elements have been maintained and frankly flourish, right? I think we're still a very small company. And I do think there's something to be said for keeping things tight, keeping things relatively small, and, cutting down on the bureaucracy and the, just trying to keep the company small. I mean, I do fundamentally believe in that. And I think that element of the culture, I believe, has continued to be very strong at ALX. I think over time, though, things do have to change, right? When you're a company of 5, it's different than when you're 50, and now we're, north of 80. And I do think you have to evolve, and, it takes more process and more communication. And, there does tend to be a heavier need to develop process and allow yourself to scale, so it's not, chaos, so to speak. And I do think that's where, I think that can be really hard for a small company to navigate. I think we've done it well, where we've preserved a lot of what I think has defined the company's success, while also, just trying to adapt to being in the midst of a really significant growth period.
Yeah, that's very like Steve Jobs-esque thinking. He said that Apple was the largest startup in the world. They were very idea-led, not hierarchy-led, wanted to move quickly, make decisions quickly, and nailing that's so difficult. I guess from your side, how much emphasis and time do you put on culture, what do you do? Because I think we've been looking into it quite a lot as a company, and you realize it's not just values written on a page, it's distilling behaviors almost into a company. I think it's so hard to get right.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I think one of the things that I've observed is, I think once a culture is set, it's very hard to change. So I do think a part of it is getting it right in the early days and building on it. Because I think if you find yourself in a culture that gets overly competitive or bureaucratic, or, or the flip, I'm from Minnesota, so I can speak to the Midwest side of this, which is sometimes, you don't have the direct conversation. You have more passive aggressiveness. You have that, right? Which is also not great. Those companies, I think, can look like they have a great culture, but nobody's having the real conversation, so to speak. So I think as ALX, I mean, this company is not one that's big into, culture retreats and doing trust falls and, those sorts of things. It's as you said, I mean, it's living it every day. How do we work together as a team? What do our actions say, right? How do we do and live those things? And, I try to achieve that with a lot of one-on-ones with my team. I think we try to do, really the bare minimum of meetings, but when we do have meetings, we're going to use that time well and efficiently and be transparent about what's up, both good and bad. And yeah, I mean, I'm a long way from Steve Jobs to understate. I just think but I think some of what he said was exactly right. Even when Apple was huge, right? It's keeping it small, lean, and not a lot of layers. And he also was really resistant to hiring, which may be not good for your podcast here, but keeping that super tight is really important. Because I just am a big believer in what small, relatively understaffed teams can do when they're kind of unleashed and unburdened. So anyway, those are the things that we try to do. Again, it's not perfect, and I don't think we spend a lot of time, maybe not enough time, talking about culture. It's more of, I'd say, kind of action based. Yeah.
It's actually weird what you say about hiring, because I suppose we're thinking about how we hire. Our mentality is we hire the best recruiters in the industry. And I think when you're small and nimble and you've got your culture absolutely nailed down, there's a great opportunity to sell to the best people in the market. It's like, are we thinking in our head, is there a point where we almost drop the standard? Or do we just keep it high and not really focus on that headcount number? And we're definitely thinking the latter. So, yeah. Which again is like probably opposite of what I need to be saying to the basic industry about hiring. But
no,
I genuinely believe that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the right approach, and I think that's how you build something to last, so to speak, right? I mean, I think in the hiring side, when you get that right, and if you're a recruiter and engaged with a company and you nail the hire, even if it takes longer, right? And those are then the recruiters that end up leading to the next job and the next job. And I think it's how you build a network of really good operators too. So, yeah, I mean, and it's consistent with what we do too. I mean, I look at the amount of interviews and referencing and time, frankly, it takes us to recruit, which can be a frustration for me, but I do think it takes time to get it right. So we try to be relatively patient and frankly, a little slow when it comes to hiring, because I think that leads to better decisions.
Yeah, 100%. And look, the next question coming up, what strategy to employ to ensure new hires align with those values?
Yeah.
You mentioned interviewing it. I think it's really hard to do from the start, but what do you think on that front?
Yeah, I think interviewing is really important. Having it be more of an experience-based case study type of interview, I think is important. But I do think back channel referencing is really important. I think looking at a number of different candidates is really important. I think, at times you can get very beholden to a certain spec. But one of the things I've learned is just, go out there and start, right? Just start talking to people. And as you do that and you're exploring what, the talent pool looks like for a particular role, that often then helps define your spec and what you're actually looking for. And I think through that, then you can get to the right pool of people. But I think we talked about it before, in order to maintain the culture, the first thing to get right is just getting the right people in the right seats to begin with. And I think, that's where hiring and interviewing and all this comes into play. So, I'm a big fan of the kind of case study based interview, as well as getting references from folks, that are outside the reference sheet. And then having the interview process have a lot of touch points across the team and board if it's a senior position. So everybody is bought into that person and what they're going to bring.
What do you, because everyone's so opinionated about this, at least I've found, what do you think about personality tests and like that extra data point?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't been doing as much of that at ALX. I do know others do a lot of that. Maybe we should be doing more. I just don't know how it necessarily translates. And I do think past experience is usually predictive of future success when it comes to people, at least. And I think that's best gained through what did they do in their prior role? What were they like? How did they, perform when things didn't go well? And I think you can get more truth in that versus a battery of tests. But again, we haven't used it, so it's probably a good tool. I know those tests have come a long way, but again, it's just not something we've employed.
Yeah, I think it's just an extra data point when I see it, because track record experience is always going to come top, and then interviews and how you get along with that person, then probably references, and then if you're still on the fence, that's when you probably start considering what a personality test looks like and how it compares to your other top performers in that job function. That's the way I've always viewed it. I think if you're putting emphasis on that at the top, then you're doing it the wrong way around.
Yeah. And I also think, I've watched how, team can impact the individual, and, how does, for example, a really introverted, more thoughtful personality play. And there's certain teams where that type is what you need, right? Versus in another team, it can just not resonate. So, I think the context it depends, right? So, yeah.
Let's talk about you as a leader. How do you approach leadership, and how has it influenced the company's direction and morale?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think, at ALX, the company was in a really great spot under John Pons, who I mentioned, who's just a brilliant scientist and led the company from day one through the IPO, and had agreed to stay on as CEO for 2 years. Ended up doing 3. Interacting with investors and doing the public company thing was, not how Jama would define a great day at the office. I mean, he loves science, and frankly, the world needs him doing that. But I just mentioned that because I think his leadership style does really align with a lot of the things I try to do as well. I mean, if you look at the team and culture he built, it was all about being small, nimble, gritty, fast, comfort with failure, and being really led by data, right? And I think that stuff is still what is in our core. And I do think, as a new CEO or a new person, period, I think making radical changes to culture is just very hard for one person. And I don't care if you're Steve Jobs or who you are. That is very, very challenging. So for me, and stylistically, I think having that as the foundation was really important. I think what I am bringing is more in line with where we are as a stage of the company. And I think it's bringing some process, bringing more communication, more cross-functional talk, things that in the earlier days were just so easy, right? Because when you had 10, 20 people, that stuff, you didn't need a meeting because the meeting was your company, right? It wasn't needed. So I think bringing an element of that has been important. And I think, it's really from a style perspective, getting us where we are to make the transition to a more late stage, clinical stage oncology company. And when you're at this stage, it's a different weighting of priorities, right? I mean, what you're doing in the clinic, how you're thinking about strategy in terms of the next study that you're running, what is the data saying from X study that's reading out, and how does that inform where we go in a super rapidly changing landscape like oncology is now really important, right? This stuff is really important for our success. And so I think to me, it's just, shifting things to be appropriate to stage, right? And the things that we're focused on now are different than in the early days. But then maintaining, the scientific backbone to what we do and not losing that part of it. And again, Steve Jobs talked a lot about this too. I mean, he talked about how over the years, marketing and commercial and product people would become the loudest voices, right? And that happens in biotech as well, where you have commercial and late development people who are who end up making the big decisions. But it's just like in tech, right? If you lose the product focus, the science and the R&D kind of compass, even in the later stages of development, you can really blow it. And so I think having the voices of R&D around, okay, well, we're seeing this in the clinical data, but why we're seeing this dates back to an in vitro study we did in 2016. And so now that's important because it means we should be going here, not there. And I mean, that's, I think, something any biotech wrestles with too, is preserving that, preserving the scientific foundation, even when the voices get louder as you get, closer and closer to launch.
That's so interesting. That's really interesting. Just moving on to the technology a little bit, can you just elaborate on ALX's key technologies and how they're going to impact patient care as well?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned a little earlier, we're in the CD47 space. I mentioned the two schools of thought, the conventional approach to targeting CD47 versus what we're doing with a dead FC, and combining that with an anti-cancer antibody to provide the eat me signal. So we're blocking the CD47 signaling, or the don't eat me signal, and then using an antibody, for example, to provide the eat me signal. CD47 is widely expressed across the body. It's one of the primary ways in which our bodies, our healthy cells, communicate to the immune system to be left alone. And therefore, it is a very, very important pathway. It's a fundamental pathway, in biology, but it's also very tricky, right? Because it's expressed everywhere. And so the beauty of our approach is that by blocking CD47, and then relying on an anti-cancer antibody like Herceptin, which then uses HER2 to provide the directionality, to provide the targeting, we're able to essentially combine the both worlds, right? I mean, that's what makes us so different than the other approaches where they had an active FC and were essentially trying to do both, and just weren't able to do that in a way that was safe or as effective as what we've been able to do. So what's been super fun is, again, a lot of what we saw in the early days scientifically have now been playing out in the clinic. We have 9 ongoing clinical trials, 3 of which are randomized. So, getting to randomized data in a new target is super important. And that's right where we are. We have more data reading out, randomized data reading out this month in gastric. We have 2 randomized studies in head and neck reading out Q4, Q1. And it's exciting. I mean, it's exciting, after almost a decade here, to be at a spot where we're getting some real answers in the clinic.
Yeah. Where do you see yourself? You just mentioned some of the milestones there. But where do you see yourself over, say, the next few years? Can you look that far, or?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think we're at this really interesting point where we've had a ton of data reading out, right? We had the gastric data in the fall. We had NHL data at AACR. We had data in bladder cancer at ASCO. We have more data coming up in July and even more coming up in head and neck soon. So it's all of this data, I think, coming together at an interesting time. And then how do we then look at the data and make decisions on where we're going? And I think what's exciting right now for us is, we believe we're seeing a strong signal across all three of our main pillars of combination agents. So whether it's combining with an antibody, with a checkpoint inhibitor like Pembro, or with an ADC, we think we have a drug that's potentially synergistic across all three. So for us, it's how do we think about moving forward across those three? We think the antibody story is the most de-risked at this point. And so I think pushing forward there with additional studies is what we're actively contemplating. And then as the other two mature, doing the same there. So, I think it's this balance of being aggressive and fast moving, but also making sure we're looking at the data as it comes and then making decisions that are data-based on, kind of where we go from here.
Nice. And then looking back on your career journey, what advice would you give to your younger self if you were starting out in biotech again?
Yeah, well, it'd be a long list depending on which younger self we're talking to. But I think, it's a total cliche, but picking the people well is really important. And having a real understanding of when it's working versus when it's not, and when it's not, understanding quickly that sometimes it's good to just move on and find the right people to surround yourself with. I think for me, I've been super lucky. Dumb luck, I'm sure, but to just have got in with a lot of great people along the way who were incredible mentors. And I think prioritizing in the early days, what I would say to my dumb self, slightly less dumb now, but still dumb, I'm sure. But what I would say is just, prioritize that over role or title, or, I just think back to me 20 years ago. I was very focused on those things, right? Role, title, comp, this other stuff. And I think where I made good career decisions, it was prioritizing, people and where they were going and their vision and what they could ultimately bring versus some of the other things that, when you're in your 20s feel really important, but actually aren't in the long run. So I'd say that, and then just, being patient and, I think thinking about things in steps, but not trying to over plan the future. I look back to, with people I went to business school with, and I think the ones that have had maybe not the best trajectory are the ones that were super focused on trying to pick every move. Right. Where I think if you're a little more open to what comes at you and a little more organic in how you think about your own growth and being open, frankly, to how things play out and what, presents itself versus trying to be super forceful and prescriptive, I think is better. I think it leads to unique opportunities. I mean, when I, first started in consulting, I never thought I was going to be in VC. I couldn't spell venture capital, right? I certainly wouldn't have envisioned I would be in this role at a biotech company. So, that's probably the other advice to my dumb self would be to just trust the process, right? And go with the flow. And I think things work out in interesting and fun ways when you do that.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, just remain open to what comes your way as well. I've always, I think that about people my age as well, they can be almost too shut off, I tell them about an opportunity or whatever it is, and it's just an outright no. I think hearing people out is definitely, really interesting. But look, thanks so much for coming on, Jason. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Sure. Well, enjoyed it. Thanks to you, Max. Hope it was at least somewhat helpful. But really appreciate your time and interest in ALX. So thank you.
No, I'm really fascinated. I mean, I definitely resonated with a whole lot of what you were saying as well, which I think is really interesting. So I think a lot of people will definitely think the same thing.
Great. Well, it hasn't been a straight line, that's for sure. And I'm sure it won't be from here. So
yeah, I don't think biotech as an industry helps, put it that way.
Right, exactly. You gotta love it. You gotta love the victories, but you also gotta love the surprises and tragedy of it all too. So
yeah, 100%. Well, thanks for everyone for listening, and please like and subscribe to the BioHub. Thank you so much, Jason.
All right. Thanks, Max. Take care. We'll see you.